Have you ever wondered if there was an ancient secret so disturbing that people tried to hide it for centuries? A story wrapped in layers of rumor and contradiction. A narrative that might reshape our understanding of ritual, sacrifice, and even how societies cope with parting from one another. Many have heard whispers of a mysterious event called the Farewell Feast, an alleged blood magic ceremony said to have emerged in the heart of ancient Greece. Today, we will step back in time to see whether this story of drinking blood, feasting on flesh, and performing a spiritual bond was ever real, or if it has been inflated by fear and confusion. More importantly, we will ask ourselves why these stories matter and what they reveal about the human need for ritual, for the sacred, and for defining our place before the divine. Throughout history, humanity has always sought ways to appease the deities they believed in, to unify their communities through sacred traditions, and to maintain the sense that their souls were somehow bound together. Ancient Greece, famed for its philosophers, tragedies, temples, and city-states, was also a culture of rituals, myths, and divine encounters. The official records often highlight festivals such as the Panathenea in Athens, or the processions of Dionysus. Yet in the background, more obscure accounts speak of something dark, something that seemed to brush the line between a revered farewell ceremony and a horrific display of bloodletting. Some called it the Farewell Feast. Some whispered that it was a blood magic rite, and still others dismissed it entirely as a scandalous myth invented by political adversaries. Though you may wonder why, in this day and age, we should care about rumors of an old Greek custom involving sacrificial blood, let us consider that rituals, especially those involving the threshold between life and death, tell us who we are as humans. They highlight our capacity to form bonds, to worship, and to interpret the unknown. And they also remind us that we can distort, sensationalize, or even bury the truth if it challenges established norms. History has proven time and again that if a group sees the potential to manipulate a story for power, they will. Perhaps in the uncertain centuries that followed the peak of Greece's power, rival city-states or even rising empires found it convenient to depict certain Greek cults as bloodthirsty or savage. Or perhaps there was a real kernel of truth in these rumors. By taking an honest look at the alleged farewell feast, we might just learn more about the mechanisms of faith and ceremony in our own time, including how different peoples around the world have used blood in sacrifices or commemorations. Before we delve into these stories, let us recall that no culture is monolithic. Even in ancient Greece, city-states had different deities they favored, different rites they observed, and distinct interpretations of the same myth. Some believed in oracles and consulted them for warfare or agriculture decisions, while others emphasized household worship or sacrifice to a specific god. We can turn to a biblical perspective here, where the idea of sacrifice has also played a crucial role in shaping spiritual identity. In the book of Leviticus, we read about the importance of blood in sacrifice. Leviticus 17, verse 11 states, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul." This passage demonstrates a profound respect for blood as a carrier of life, something that must be used carefully in ceremonial contexts. It is worth pondering how the concept of blood as life or atonement might have appeared in polytheistic contexts as well, and if that could form the background for a ritual in Greece that placed unusual emphasis on blood. Still, we should not assume that everything said about the ancient Greek farewell feast is factual. Many historians have doubts. In the centuries after the Roman conquest of Greece, Roman authors sometimes accused Greek cults of bizarre practices, just as the Greeks in earlier times sometimes accused foreign peoples of savage rites. It was a tactic, an effort to create a sense of moral or cultural superiority. Additionally, after the spread of Christianity, some Christian writers repeated or even exaggerated tales of pagan blood rituals to condemn paganism as barbaric. Meanwhile, evidence on the ground, such as temple remains, inscriptions, or physical altars, seldom confirms these dramatic accounts. So we are left to decide, do we trust scattered references from suspicious sources? Or do we accept that the farewell feast might be an invention? Perhaps part of the truth lies in the confusion around which deity was involved. Some say it was a hidden cult devoted to Hecate, the goddess associated with witchcraft and the crossroads, while others link it to Dionysus, a god associated with wine, ecstasy, and occasionally the more frenzied rites of the Maenads. In many Greek myths, there is a motif of dismemberment or the offering of flesh which might have fed into these rumors. In the story of Dionysus Zagreus, for example, the young god is torn to pieces by the Titans, and those who interpret the myth in the context of Orphic theology sometimes link it to ritual consumption of raw flesh. Yet no mainstream Greek festival, as documented by reliable sources, demanded that participants actually drink human blood or tear a person limb from limb. The suggestion of an organized farewell ceremony might relate to a funerary context, perhaps where blood was used symbolically to seal the separation between the living and the dead. Or perhaps it was used in bonding ceremonies, an oath that members of a group would never betray each other, sealed by a portion of blood. Certainly, Greek literature abounds with references to blood in magical contexts, particularly in necromancy. In Homer's Odyssey, Book 11, lines 23 through 50, we read of Odysseus pouring out blood for the souls of the dead so they might speak. The text says that Odysseus slaughtered sheep so their blood would fill a pit, and only by tasting this blood could the ghosts find the power to speak. Though this does not prove that a widespread farewell feast existed, it does confirm that some Greeks believed blood could serve as a channel between realms, especially if one wanted communication or a special bond with spirits. Let us step beyond the boundaries of Greek tradition for a moment and see how other cultures were labeled or misunderstood for their sacrificial rites. The Aztecs, for instance, performed elaborate human sacrifices, cutting out the beating heart on top of their pyramids, and the Maya also engaged in bloodletting rituals, sometimes with the noble classes using sharp objects to pierce their own bodies, then offering their blood as a link to the gods. Europeans who arrived in the Americas found these rites shocking and used the stories to portray indigenous peoples as savage or in need of conquest. Yet from the viewpoint of those societies, these rites were sacred. They believed they were sustaining the cosmos and honoring their deities. Meanwhile, the African continent has been repeatedly subjected to accusations of dark rituals, partly because foreign commentators often misread or maliciously distorted local ceremonies. In fact, across many African traditions, communal meals, libations, and sacrifice exist, but are often misunderstood by outsiders. Is it possible that some rumors about Greek blood rites were similarly generated by outsiders or later commentators? We should also acknowledge that too often in Western scholarship, African or Black contributions to ancient civilizations have been diminished or overlooked. People sometimes forget that the ancient Mediterranean world, including Greece, interacted extensively with parts of Africa, from Egypt in the east to Carthage in the west, and that travelers, traders, and religious ideas moved back and forth. Black people were not only present in these societies, but contributed to various cultural, philosophical, and religious developments. Some scholars highlight that Greek mystical thought, such as Orphic rites, might have borrowed from Egyptian or other African influences. Over time, the reality of this cultural exchange was hidden or dismissed by Eurocentric historians. In the same way, it is likely that if a farewell feast existed in some fringe cult in Greece, and if some aspects of it derived from foreign influences, The record might have been erased or manipulated to preserve a notion of Greek uniqueness, or to demonize foreign tradition. We do not claim that the farewell feast is entirely African in origin, but we must remain open to the possibility that cross-cultural rituals shape what we now call Greek customs. While investigating the place of Africa or people of African heritage in these narratives, we recall that historically, the Bible also has been used to distort or belittle Black identity. This has led to centuries of misunderstandings, such as the so-called curse of Ham interpretation, which is neither biblical nor moral. Yet if we read the words carefully, we see that in Genesis 1, verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. This universal statement affirms that the entire human family, including those with African ancestry, stands equally before the Creator. When we turn to the New Testament, in Acts 8, verses 27 to 39, we find the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, a person of African origin, who was reading scripture and received direct guidance from Philip. This passage signals that in the early Christian movement, Africans were welcomed into the faith with no sign of inferiority. The text says, "And he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, an eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem for to worship, was returning, and sitting in his chariot read Isaiah the prophet." Then it describes how Philip was called by the Spirit to join him, explain the scriptures, and ultimately baptize him. When we read that portion, it becomes clear that neither the color of his skin nor his geographic origin mattered. The eunuch's sincerity and desire for truth took precedence. Thus, if certain groups in history tried to suggest that Africans were excluded or lesser in spiritual matters, they opposed the fundamental biblical teaching that all are made in God's image and can receive truth. Returning to the puzzle of the farewell feast, it might also be relevant to see how Africa or Black individuals might have been present in or around Greek religious spaces. Some historical references mention Ethiopians in Greek epics, often described as blameless or favored by certain gods. Greek art sometimes depicts people of African descent among worshippers or traveling merchants. Over time, as power structures shifted, the narrative that overshadowed Black contributions or presence became more pronounced, especially with the later racism of modern centuries. It is possible that if the farewell feast was a real event, or if there was some blood magic ceremony, the input of foreign influences or the involvement of Africans could have been erased or sensationalized. Alternatively, if the ritual was a local Greek phenomenon, outsiders might have labeled it with heavy prejudice, thus turning a possibly symbolic meal into an image of cannibalistic frenzy or demonic worship. Historians remain divided on whether the farewell feast was real. Some point to references from later writers like the Roman historian Cassius Dio, or scattered remarks from Christian apologists who described impious Greek rites, but the direct evidence is sparse. Others say it might have been a slander invented to undermine Greek states during times of crisis or justify Roman or Christian subjugation. In modern archaeology, there is no conclusive site that can be identified with such a practice. Yet, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We know that many secrets of religious cults in ancient times were carefully hidden from the masses, with initiates sworn to silence. If the rumored feast belonged to a small clandestine group of worshippers, perhaps dedicated to a chthonic deity, the lack of mention in official inscriptions should not surprise us. From an anthropological perspective, blood rituals are not uncommon worldwide, sometimes used for bonding or sealing a solemn vow. If we approach it from that lens, the farewell feast might not have been all that shocking in principle, except that it supposedly involved direct human consumption of blood or flesh. However, Any record of actual human sacrifice or cannibalism in classical Greece is extremely rare. The stories that do exist typically describe it as a crime, a perversion, or an extraordinary event. That raises the possibility that the farewell feast was either an extreme heretical act or a purely mythical label. Why then has it been misunderstood or overshadowed for so long? In part because any tale of blood magic stirs our deepest anxieties. People attach these stories to sensational claims, or they use them as rhetorical weapons to denounce an opponent's religion. Another factor is that the modern imagination often conflates multiple sources. We see references to Orphic or Dionysian dismemberment rituals in drama. We see the necromancy in Homer's Odyssey, and we see scattered references to blood-binding rites for certain oath-bound fraternities. As time passed, these disparate elements could have merged into a single horrific rumor known as the Farewell Feast. Then, in an era when Christian scribes wanted to show that Greek paganism was evil, they repeated or embroidered these rumors. Over the centuries, the topic was overshadowed because people might have found it more convenient to dismiss it altogether or to use it for shock value. Only in modern times have we begun piecing together partial references to see if there is a coherent underlying practice, or if it was a mosaic of invented claims. Let us for a moment entertain how it might have looked if it were real. Imagine a small group of initiates gathering in a hidden grove near midnight. Perhaps it was a funeral or a farewell to someone about to depart, or more dramatically, an offering for a dying leader. They might have prayed to a chthonic deity, calling for eternal unity in the afterlife. Perhaps they used an animal's blood, or even a combination of wine and a small portion of human blood, drawn from a volunteer. They might have believed that by drinking from the same chalice, they shared one essence, and this fits certain patterns of oath or vow rituals recorded in various ancient cultures. Over time, rumors claimed it was a wholesale feast of flesh, and opponents leaped upon that notion, labeling it savage. The misunderstanding or distortion might have come from partial witnesses, or from stories repeated by anxious travelers. By the time it made its way into certain texts, the farewell feast was portrayed as an all-out cannibal rite. If it had a hidden spiritual dimension, the original meaning was forgotten. In our day, we must approach the subject with humility, recognizing that many details remain uncertain. We should also remember that across civilizations, from the Aztec to the Greek to countless African societies, the symbolism of blood and the act of communal partaking was not always malevolent, but often deeply sacred, a means of binding people to each other or to the divine. In Christianity itself, the sacrament of communion involves partaking of bread and wine, symbolizing the body and blood of Christ, though it is not literal blood and flesh. This resonates with biblical passages such as John 6, verses 53 to 56, where Jesus says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, ye have no life in you. Whoso eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh..." Though Christians interpret this spiritually, there is an undeniable link between blood, communal unity, and divine presence. If we see that parallel, perhaps the ancient Greeks had their own manner of attributing sacred power to blood, though without the Christian context of symbolic representation. One might also consider why those with power or influence might have sought to obscure or distort the farewell feast. Could it be that the ceremony bridged certain social classes or threatened the political order by creating bonds stronger than loyalty to the state? Or maybe it was turned into a taboo by external forces, seeking to unite the Greek city-states under a more sanitized version of religion. Or again, foreign historians could have used it as a tool of propaganda. Since the classical era, Many secrets of small sects or cults were branded as monstrous to discourage public curiosity. If such a ritual had ties to Africa, or if Africans participated or contributed aspects to it, that part might have been conveniently erased once the power structures changed. We see a parallel in how certain accounts of African religious practices were twisted by colonial writers who depicted them in the worst possible light, ignoring their spiritual significance, and by doing so, they justified their own expansionist goals. In our modern context, we should be careful not to perpetuate the divisions of the past. Indeed, the message of Scripture insists that each person is loved by God. Galatians 3 verse 28 states, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." Though the historical or political context differ, the spiritual principle remains that all humanity is equal. If there were misunderstandings about Greek rites or African rituals, if there were propaganda efforts to demonize one group or to hide the dignity of another, we must correct those errors now. That is why unveiling the truth is not about mocking ancient customs, but about acknowledging the complexity of human devotion and the lengths to which people have gone to consecrate their farewells, their covenants, and their bonds. So was the farewell feast truly a terrifying blood banquet, or was it a modest symbolic ceremony that got blown out of proportion? The answer may lie somewhere in between. We cannot dismiss the possibility that a small sect practiced some form of oath-binding meal involving blood, and we also cannot confirm that it was widespread or that it involved cannibalism. Historians and archaeologists continue to debate the authenticity of references to that feast, and even so, the story itself demonstrates how easily a practice can be sensationalized or manipulated. It is also a reminder that societies have often used ritual to express the gravity of goodbyes, whether that farewell is to the deceased, to those departing on dangerous journeys, or to the illusions that separate one from another. The question remains, is it fact or myth? In exploring these controversies, let us never forget the humanity behind the story. Though the ancient Greeks lived in a world quite different from ours, they were still people striving for transcendence, seeking to honor their beliefs and leaving behind testimonies of their relationships with the gods. Ancient texts show that their communities used feasts, sacrifices, and gatherings to unify families, soldier bands, and citizens. The notion that some might add a dimension of blood consumption for an even deeper spiritual bond is not implausible, especially when we see parallels in other ancient cultures. And yet the shocking nature of such a practice made it an easy target for exaggeration. This is how controversies grow. Combine a kernel of truth with rumor, political motives, and centuries of retelling, and you get a monstrous tale that might overshadow the real tradition. If we feel unsettled by the idea that revered figures of the ancient Greek world could have participated in something so graphic, let us remember the many complicated stories that swirl around every civilization, including our own. Humans can act with great virtue or descend into cruelty, and the presence of a rumored blood ritual does not erase the profound achievements of Greek civilization. Meanwhile, if we judge them harshly, we should also examine how other societies, including certain medieval Christian movements, were rumored to have engaged in dreadful superstitions or punishments, or how in modern times, the manipulations of propaganda might mischaracterize entire groups. All of it points to the same lesson. Never let a single story define an entire people. We see that the Bible calls us to a different standard, one that exalts the inherent value of every human being. In Romans 10, verses 12 to 13, we read, "For there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." This universal openness speaks volumes. It invites us to examine every cultural story or rumor through the lens of compassion and fairness, to consider the dignity and context of others. Perhaps in the case of the farewell feast, we discovered that people were quick to believe the worst because it served their agenda, or perhaps the ceremony was misunderstood. Either way, we are reminded that truth must be handled with care, that every claim demands study, and that no group should be permanently cast as savage or unholy. Today, let us unite in acknowledging that we do not have all the answers, but we yearn to uncover the truth. The farewell feast might remain a puzzle, an intersection where belief, myth, fear, and politics collide. Yet from it, we can glean insights into the universal longing for a bond that transcends physical presence, for a ritual that cements our love and commitment, especially in moments of parting. At the same time, we can see how easy it is for such a ritual to be misunderstood, twisted, or weaponized if we fail to keep an open mind and a compassionate heart. It is now time for us to reflect, to share, and to keep searching. If you have ever felt drawn to the hidden corners of history, if you are curious about how ancient peoples, including those from African backgrounds, have been portrayed or neglected in the grand tapestry of civilization, I encourage you to research further. Look up the references to necromancy in Homer's Odyssey and reflect on how they compare to any rumored farewell feast. Seek out scholarly works on Orphic or Dionysian rites, see how they describe the use of blood in worship, and question whether you find any parallels to what the myths say about this final meal. Above all, consider how your own tradition, or your own sense of spiritual belonging, relates to the concept of blood as a sacred element. If you find the notion of the farewell feast intriguing, let your curiosity guide you to read the Bible passages we shared today in full context to see how the ancient scriptures treat the subject of blood and sacrifice. Perhaps you will discover deeper truths about how we, as one human family, differ in outward rituals but still share the same longing to connect with the divine. Remember that, as believers or seekers of truth, we are called to respect one another's heritage. Let us push back against any narrative that demeans Black identity or tries to overshadow Africa's rightful role in shaping the spiritual tapestry of the ancient world. And let us also recognize that the complexities of Greek traditions deserve more than a one-sided condemnation. History is seldom black and white. It is often gray, brimming with nuances and hidden layers. Even if the farewell feast was never more than a rumor or a propaganda tool, it tells us something about how humans handle the threshold of life, death, separation, and union. It resonates with the universal quest to preserve relationships beyond physical distance, in a way echoing the Bible's emphasis on the power of blood to seal covenants, though from a very different angle. It may have inspired both awe and terror, leaving behind conflicting accounts. Now, centuries later, we step into the role of gleaners of truth, sifting through ancient texts and modern biases in the hope of clarifying what truly happened. In the end, each of us stands as a valuable creation before God, no matter our background or skin color. We can uphold that truth by becoming vessels of mutual respect, by learning from the past, and by cultivating unity in the present. If you find this message compelling, I invite you to do a few things. Take a moment to like this video if you have learned something new or if it inspired deeper thought, and share it with someone who loves history or who wants to explore the intersections of ritual, blood, and sacred tradition. Write your own thoughts in the comments, whether you believe the farewell feast was fact or myth, and let us know if you see parallels to other cultures or even your own faith tradition. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so, and join us in continuing this journey of uncovering hidden truths and restoring what may have been lost or misunderstood. May the path ahead be illuminated by a spirit of honesty, humility, and hope, and may we all affirm one another's worth as we seek knowledge with open hearts. I thank you for spending this time with me, and I trust that our dive into this mysterious legend of ancient Greece has sparked reflection and perhaps a renewed appreciation for how deeply ritual and faith can intertwine. Farewell feasts, blood magic, hidden histories, they might seem far removed from our modern routines, yet they speak to a universal longing for meaning and connection. May we honor that longing in all peoples, acknowledging that sometimes, when we strip away the rumors and propaganda, what remains is a reflection of that divine image we all bear, shining through every race, every land, and every era. May God bless you, and may we all continue to journey together, seeking greater understanding and unity. Let us stand together, forging a shared communion of knowledge, unafraid of facing the mysteries of the past, and eager to embrace one another as we move forward in truth.